Welcome everyone back to the ReluTech Podcast. In case you didn't notice, I'm not at home this time. I know usually I'm in my little recording studio in the basement talking to tech professionals over the internet because we're all in this cloud age where we can do this. But sometimes you got to get out and about, and I was fortunate enough to know some folks who run a museum and founded a museum on for that matter. So I want to welcome Lonnie Mims, founder and chairman of the Mimms Museum of Technology and Art. Welcome, Lonnie.
Hello. Yes, welcome to the museum.
So it's a pleasure to be here. I've been to this museum a number of times, being a Roswell local myself, so it's one of the cooler things that we have over here, as well as being a tech person. If anyone likes technology, you can kind of find yourself lost in here for a few hours. Today, though, for the sake of our podcast, we had a conversation that's very relevant to the viewers that we have, which is the cloud, which, you know, the cloud's a more recent development in the computing world, but there was a lot of steps that led up to it. So to start the conversation for this, we're going to do the history of computing leading up to the modern cloud, and we're going to start with this wooden device that we're standing in front of. If anyone can't tell, this is a computer. No, just kidding, Lonnie. Tell us what it is.
This is a Jacquard loom from the mid-1800s. But Jacquard, who was a Frenchman, actually invented the Jacquard loom in 1799. So you're taking us all the way back to the late 1700s.
It's something that goes back, and if you think about it, textile, looming, there's a lot of patterns, right? If we think of code, probably think of a lot of patterns. So looming was probably a very natural progression for where we might start coding things in historically. There is a lot of debate, what was the first computer, what was the first use of code, but this is commonly brought up as one of the most common examples of using code to solve problems. Now, as you can see here, there's a lot of different mechanics that are actually weaving this out, but what you get in the finished product is this nice pattern. And this is actually done via punch cards. So many of you who know some of the earlier computing might be familiar with how punch cards have been used, and we'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But the sophistication that a loom like this can create is pretty astounding. Because if you look to the other side of me, what you might think is a picture is not, in fact, a picture. What is that, Lonnie?
Yeah, this is actually one of the more complex weaves that was done in Jacquard's time. So this is a weave of Jacquard himself, and it's done in silk. So for every single thread that would go across would be represented by one card. And the cards tell the loom which of the horizontal or the vertical threads to pull up or to leave down, so that you end up with potentially very complex patterns. And they did several different designs to demonstrate the capabilities. And we show a blow up here of his face just to show that it is in fact threads.
It's immensely detailed. When you look at it on the close side vision, you see all these little black specks in it that just capture all these little things that have to happen. And, you know, for the people watching, you might not be able to read the card there, but it explains that 24,000 punched cards were used to create this portrait. So if you're thinking about that in the 1800s, it's unbelievable the complexity that this unlocked and the ideas that it generated in some other folks 100 or so years later.
Well, actually, much sooner than that we know for certain that Charles Babbage actually ordered this very weave. They didn't have these just sitting on a shelf somewhere. You had to actually order it, and then they would produce it at that point. And Babbage ordered one of these, so we know that he was aware of the idea of storing data in the form of holes in a card.
Yeah, he saw the potential in it, and it was his difference engine, right? That he brought to the table.
He started with the difference engine and then worked towards the analytical engine. And of course, neither one was built other than a very small piece for demonstration.
And many after his time, if I'm correct. That people started trying to really finish these after he passed.
They in the last probably 15, 20 years, they've actually built a couple of them at the London Science Museum.
So if you think how long it took for us to get there, immensely complex for the time.
Oh, absolutely. The gearing and the accuracy was probably just pushing the limits of what they could do at that point in time. And it was a very expensive proposition.
As many of these things are with computers and everything else, it was always big and slow and difficult at first, and it got smaller and faster and smaller and faster. Now, as these things continue to take root, it led to another kind of step from punch cards, which was something that was pretty early rooted in some of our American society infrastructure, like the census and how we administer social programs and things like that. The IBM punch card machine. And this is where a lot of people might start to think of computing. So when it comes to the IBM punch card machine, it was actually using these punch cards like this for much more of a code and organization of data fashion that starts to feel more familiar to our modern time. So can you tell us more about like when IBM got into this game?
Well, pre-IBM, there was a guy named Herman Hollerith, and there was a challenge because in 1880, they could not finish the count of the U.S. population and the other data that they were collecting.
Getting big, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it was beyond the manual process. So they put out a challenge that before the 1890 census, they wanted to have a machine or some other methodology, let's just be more general, to be able to count the census in less than a decade. It was very important.
When you have to start the next census.
Yeah, very important to know how are we going to redistribute, the Congress and who gets represented, et cetera, et cetera. So what Herman Hollerith came up with was the idea of taking a card and then having the holes represent different information, whether it was, the
city,
the city you're in, the state, whatever.
Age.
And then here's where it gets interesting is that we have pictures on the wall over here of what the first Hollerith census machine looked like. It was a series of dials on the bottom, but they would a person would be sitting at the table, at the desk. They would put the card in, and then they would pull this lever down, and it would bring down a plate that had little pins that would go into each hole. And wherever the pin went through a hole, it would connect with a pool of mercury. So this is like, pre-EPA.
Seems like a safe job.
Pre-EPA, for sure. And then every time it would connect, that one pin would connect, that one pin would go to the dial, and it would increment the dial by one. So they could just continuously put more and more of these cards into the machine and then increment these dials, and that keeps the count.
And it's processing all this information all at once instead of piece by piece by
right,
piece.
so nobody's sitting there looking at something, how somebody filled it out and checking a box, and then somebody else counting it. It's all being done at the same time.
It was huge. I mean, if you think about it, the human race gets bigger and bigger. We start needing to account for this just complexity in our world. And computers, the logical conclusion, but just to see how it came from us first trying to do textile, seeing these patterns, seeing the complexity that for what we're trying to solve and getting here, it was huge. Now, this is still very much in the early, very analog age of computing. Now, a few years later, things start to get a little more, let's say, electric with it, where they get a little more deep with the types of chips being used. So when you start moving to, for instance, chips versus punch cards, and how you can actually process data. So the next thing we're going to look at is the early age of supercomputing. Let's go over there. So now you're finding us over at probably one of the most artistic pieces of the museum besides the Dali exhibit. That's truly art, but this right here is taking really the most fundamental component of modern computing and making an art piece out of it. It's called their chip wall. Anyone in the computer industry knows chips power everything. It's behind everything we do. And there's been a lot of development on that over the decades that we've had things like this. So while this chip wall goes on pretty expansively, so we're not going to walk you guys down the whole thing, I'll give you some clips of that while we talk. We're going to talk more about some of the major developments in chip technology that this wall is covering. So can you walk us through these 5 generations of electric computing?
Well, originally, even before the first generation here, because we're only focused on electronic, not on electromechanical, but there's actually a step before this, which would have been the mechanical relays. So that's where there's something actually physically moving. But as far as the electronic side, we start with the vacuum tubes. And the vacuum tubes would essentially act as a switch, which is exactly what the relays did before it. And vacuum tubes would get hot, They had to warm up to be able to function.
I'm a guitarist, so I know a little bit about it.
Yeah, now there's
it's the only place you'll find vacuum tubes.
Well, yeah, there's vacuum tubes in a lot of the amplifiers now, and we've kind of had a retro thing going back because people feel like that gives a warmer sound.
We used digital, we tried it, they're pretty good, but vacuum tubes still have a home. Mine, admittedly, very small home.
Right.
Very small.
They found their niche. They also tended to burn out because of the heat and just it's like a light bulb. So whenever they had the first computers that used vacuum tubes, they were changing the tubes out constantly.
Yeah.
They were lucky if they could get just an hour
and they're
in
expensive
before,
to buy new ones.
Right, exactly. And then you have to find which ones burned out, etc. Then there was the invention of the individual transistor. And this is essentially a vacuum tube, but it's a completely solid state device. And each little can or each little device was one transistor. And this was a huge leap forward and enabled the computers that were made with transistors, of which the 6600 is a transistor based.
Yeah. And it starts to look more familiar too, like a chip, right?
Yeah, it starts using more traditional circuit board type setups. After that, then we had the integrated circuit, and the integrated circuit would put a lot of different components, a lot of transistors on one piece of silicon, and that was another huge step forward. We have quite a few computers in the museum that are based on chip technology, but without microprocessors.
Yep.
The next step was putting together enough transistors and components that you would combine what was a complete what they call TTL, transistor logic chip, which was usually an individual gate, like an AND gate, a NAND gate, an OR, that kind of thing, a logic.
Yeah, just a logic
gate. Put more of those together and actually put an entire computing device on one chip, and that's when the microprocessor came about. And then we really haven't quite gotten to the 5th generation yet, but it's in development, which is
it's the current generation, what you kind of argue.
And there's actually several possible directions here that we have quantum computing. There are folks working on gates that use light instead of electricity. There's also a biological direction.
I've seen some of the biological computers they've made.
So this is even more kind of diverse than at the very beginning of the microprocessor era, because we don't really know exactly what direction that's going to take and what it's going to look like yet. So
quantum
it's pretty exciting.
Biological processing couldn't be further apart in like how they function and what they're trying to do. But again, kind of in that cloud conversation that we're having, it's all about the fact that all of this is now relatively accessible by the internet. If you have a computer at home and internet access, you can actually today access quantum computers at Amazon. It's through their service called Bracket, and you can do some quantum computing processing if you have some reason for that. It is not cheap. I wouldn't recommend you do it if you don't have a good use case. But we're starting to see where all these things exist. And again, I don't know if anyone's seen a quantum computer watching the show. They're big. They're not in the microprocessor age yet. They're very big right now, and you're not going to be able to build one at home. So accessing one elsewhere is really your only shot right now. So chips are very cool. It's something that's been the backbone of all of this. But what we're going to do now is look at some of the chips that started shaping, I would argue, the data center. Really some of these consolidated spaces that needed massive amounts of processing. So we're going to move over to supercomputers now. So now we're moving on to some stuff that's getting pretty close to the cloud. We're moving into supercomputing. So there is a lot of debate on the definition of supercomputer and who's the first, and a lot of those kind of maybe more fun, little kind of, I guess, timeline elements of it, but there was some critical gear that really moved it along, and critical companies, for that matter, that moved it along. The first one we're going to talk about is a device from Controlled Data Corporation. The reason we're going to talk about this one, because while there was some argument over whether it was the first supercomputer, it was usually agreed that this is the first mainstream one that was regularly being used in laboratories and other use cases. So can you tell us a little more about the CDC 6600, who it's from, what it was used for?
Yeah, the just to elaborate a little bit, there were a lot of computers before, obviously, but the key to anything is the definition. What is the first? You can make almost anything the first if you give it enough parameters. But clearly, a lot of the computers before the CDC 6600 and some of its immediate predecessors didn't sell well. So there were only less than a handful that were out there. So as far as an impact and as far as people being able to use it, clearly the CDC machines were, if not the first, certainly one of the biggest case studies of having that much capability. And the CDC, one of the primary designers of this machine was Seymour Cray. And it's interesting that this is before California became the Silicon Valley and
it's before Silicon.
It became before it became the focus of the whole tech industry. And most of the bigger computers were made in the Northeast and the Midwest. And Control Data is an example of one of the Midwestern companies that made very large, fast computers. And Seymour Cray lived in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, and he is really one of the primary designers of the architecture of this machine. And it's a transistor-based machine. And one area that it directly relates to cloud computing is that really a predecessor to cloud computing, in a way, would be time sharing. And the CDC 6600 was used as very much as a time sharing machine. And what that meant was that even though it would only do one thing at a time, it would cycle around and it would do a little segment of things for all the different users that were logged into the system. So from a user perspective, it looked like you had the full use of the machine because it's so fast. And another thing was that you could actually dial into it using a telephone. So you could have a dumb terminal. Typically, it wouldn't even be with a modem. It would be with an acoustic coupler. And what that would be was that you would dial up the phone, and back then it really was rotary, and you would take the handset and you would plug it into these two rubber grommets, and that would allow the machine to communicate over the telephone network. And initially it was typically at about 110 baud, and if you were real lucky, you might get 300 baud. But this machine really was a trailblazer. Another thing was that the interesting eyes for the monitor. Seymour insisted that the computer not have a series of blinky lights, which was very typical of an IBM console. He wanted to actually have a screen that would show text and graphics and things like that. So that was one of the other innovations that kind of came along with the CDC 6600. And the one you're looking at right here is actually a prototype of the console. The one that actually got put on the machines in the field, you can see in the background there's a few more knobs that are right below the monitors. And so this is a pretty unique item, and we purchased this from the Living Computer Museum along with most of the collections late in 2024.
It's very exciting. I actually didn't know the timeshare feature of it. I mean, that's something that for anyone in the cloud computing space, that's what you're doing all the time. You don't have to get your own server necessarily. You can get a little bit of what you need when you need it, so everyone is able to keep the business moving forward. And for the types of laboratories and large-scale research operations this was used on in those early days, all these different scientists, that was necessary to actually complete the work. So this was a huge step, but it led to another interesting development, which is probably the most notable name in the supercomputing industry, the engineer you talked about, Seymour Cray. So he was at Control Data for this release, but afterwards, what did he decide to go do?
Well, in 1972, he left Control Data Corporation and he started his own company, and it was called, believe it or not, Cray. So from that point on, Cray became almost a household name as far as supercomputing. The first machine was the Cray 1, which we have an example of behind you, and he made the fastest computer in the world for many years. This machine came out in 1975, so it took about 3 years to get a production quality machine, and you can see how unique the look is. I mean, it doesn't look like anything now.
It looks like a fancy piece of furniture in like a Star Wars movie, right?
Yeah, and they actually nicknamed it the world's most expensive love seat.
It's a good name for it. The thing that really blew my mind reading about it is how much wiring is in these things. You talked about it took 3 years to do. It's miles and miles and miles of wiring in these things. And you guys can see it there, it's big, but the sophistication of hand wiring a device like this was always something that just absolutely flabbergasted me.
Oh, it's amazing. No wire in it is longer than 4 feet.
So if you think about that, miles and miles of wire in 4-foot intervals.
Right.
Hand done.
And they made it as a cylinder to also help minimize the length of the wires and the need to run from one chassis to the next.
For electrical grounding reasons and stuff like that.
Another interesting thing is that it was women who did the wiring.
Okay.
The idea of smaller hands, more, better dexterity coming out of a lot of the textile
It makes sense.
And so when you see pictures, you'll always see the women are the ones that are actually putting these machines together.
I do not envy them for that job. It seems like a very difficult one.
No, you think about which wires.
You should see me trying to just line a fishing line. It's not a great time. So
yeah.
It's pretty impressive. Seymour Cray, even to this day, he's probably the most noted name in supercomputing. And these types of computers continue to go through iteration after iteration until we started really getting into the data center age, right? Past mainframes, but more into the modern data center. And that's really where we're going to finish this conversation. We've talked a little bit about the earliest notions of computing. We've talked a little bit about kind of this core technology of chips that has really powered this entire vehicle from there. And then we talked a little bit about when power got introduced. Serious power was getting introduced. Now we're going to talk about when power started getting so expansive that people just had to start finding another way around it. So as we move towards the cloud, the whole point of the cloud was so that people could access extreme levels of computing from anywhere in the world as long as they had an internet access. So as we built all these supercomputers, that's fantastic when you're working in a lab with supercomputers, but it was problematic if you were nowhere close to a supercomputer. So one of the most necessary developments was the personal computer, which is really a lot of these devices may be the most familiar for much of our audience. Some of these people maybe had at home. So let's go a little bit into this. Walk us through some of these devices and the progress that led to the first Internet-enabled computers.
Oh, absolutely. The first one on our timeline is the DataPoint 2200, and this is significant because it used discrete TTL, which are individual chips that have logic components on them, like, again, we talked about earlier with NAND, and, or things like that. And the arrangement was essentially what became the Intel 8008, which is the first 8-bit microprocessor that Intel came out with. The first personal computer, according to the Boston Computer Museum, which is now the Computer History Museum in California, based on their criteria, was the Kenbach 1. This was based on discrete TTL. So again, it's pre-microprocessor, but it was available to purchase and was affordable to go into a home. The first microcomputer that actually used the Intel 8008, which again came from the logic of DataPoint 2200, was a French computer called the Microl N. And this one had switches in front you could flip the switches to set the address, put the 8-bit data in, load it in, and it could be completely run with just the lights in the front, but you could also hook a terminal to it, a dumb terminal, and be able to see characters and things on a screen. This is in the timeline. It was a machine that Xerox came out with called the Alto, and it is way ahead of its time, 1973. It's really the first computer that had what you see is what you get. It had a mouse, as you can see here. It had the cord setup, which didn't end up sticking in history.
There was a lot of trial and error on little periphery equipment over the years.
Right. And it had icons, it had all these different things, and this is what Steve Jobs saw when he went to visit Xerox PARC and ended up basing the ideas for the Lisa and the Macintosh from this concept.
This all-in-one box solution.
Yes. This is one of the first computers that you could get in the United States. And it again is based upon that first 8-bit chip, the 8008. And it was available in a kit and mostly used by folks that were into ham radio. They were kind of it was very much a hobbyist machine.
Well, computers were being built at Radio Shack first and foremost. That was the place for the early computer people.
Yeah, that came in later, but initially it was just a hobbyist thing. And on that same theme, radio electronics wanted to be, one of the first ones to be able to show, okay, here's a computer you can build. So a man named John Titus at Virginia Tech came up with a computer that you could build, and you could buy the boards to put this kit together, and it also was based upon the 8008. And the 8008 was a very limited 8-bit microprocessor. Right at this time, in 74, Intel also developed a more robust 8-bit microprocessor called the 8080. Well, not to be outdone, Popular Electronics saw this on radio electronics. They thought, okay, we're falling behind. We have to have something on our
The chip war begins.
Yeah, so they asked a man named Ed Roberts, who owned the company called MITS, Micro Instrument Telemetry Systems, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He had done a lot of different kits and things on building calculators. And they thought, well, this guy's qualified, so let's see if he can build a computer based on this new chip. So Ed Roberts took on the challenge and created the Altair 8800. And that became the lead article in the January 75 issue of Popular Electronics. Well, at this time, a guy named Paul Allen was working in Boston, and he saw this magazine cover at Harvard Square at the newsstand, and this is exactly what he was looking for, a computer that you could actually have on your desk. So he bought a copy, and he went and took it to his buddy, Bill Gates, who was living in one of the houses at Harvard and was attending Harvard at the time. And they ended up contacting Ed Roberts, and long story short, they wrote BASIC for the Altair, and we have a copy of that early BASIC. It's on paper tape, and that was the beginning of Microsoft.
It's pretty crazy how when you look at it, these are just two guys looking at hobbyist equipment in school, a little similar to Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, but just people who are just going around toying with this stuff and suddenly seeing, oh, there's a big wave coming. Mm-hmm. And you're thinking about it, and a lot of these people, it's just a couple of nerdy guys looking at some magazines, right? That's what it comes down to. So for everyone out there, if you're watching your blogs, podcasts, this, that, if you see something cool, follow it. And in the cloud, all this technology now that's at your fingertips, mm-hmm. you have a lot of room to experiment.
Absolutely. This is here because it's really the first clone, and it was an improved version of the Altair. We have a very important computer here, and it doesn't look like much, but this is an Apple I. This is the very first product that was made by the Apple company.
And there's not many of them.
Yeah, they made, some debate, but somewhere between 160 and 200 of these in the beginning. And initially they were sold at the Byte Shop, which was the first computer store, and it was in Silicon Valley. But you had to add a power supply, a couple transformers to this. You had to add a keyboard.
So very kit, yeah.
Yeah, again, it was hobbyist. All of this is still very much hobbyist. You had to add a monitor to it, but this was all of the components needed for a computer. It has the memory, the processor, the video display drivers, all of that is on this one board. So that's the genius of Steve Wozniak.
And he soldered that in the garage. So all of you have heard the story about Apple starting in a garage? Mm-hmm. That's from the garage.
Right, exactly. This is again, there's a lot of evolution. Everything is being built on what's before. This company started out making boards for the Altair, and they made very, very high quality boards. They finally decided to make their own computer. So this one came out in '76, and it incorporated the idea of having the keyboard. Most of it is in one device except for the monitor. And again, for all these machines, the outside storage typically was a cassette recorder.
Yeah. So and tape, all that kind of stuff.
Really, the floppy drive did come along at the Altair phase, but
still wasn't necessarily common.
It was a very expensive option, and it wasn't totally common. People were still using cassettes.
Yeah, and again, like with all these things where everyone's building on each other, so there's a few missteps along the way. Like I know Steve Jobs, for instance, he came from Atari, and that was a big thing that made him want a user interface with color, because that was a big thing for him at Atari. Like he had convinced them this game needs color, and I don't care if it takes memory away from the game. We figure it out, and he did, and he made a game that was beautiful for the time, supposedly.
And 1977 is really, this is the year that the computer arrived in most people's homes. So you had three very, very popular machines that came out in 1977. You had the Apple II, which is a vast improvement on the Apple I. You had the TRS-80, and you had the Commodore PET. And these three machines really introduced the micro computer into mainstream America.
Yeah, you can buy it all at once. You don't have to toy with it. It's not a hobbyist thing. I mean, it's maybe a little bit of a unique interest at that time still, but it's past where like you have to be a little bit engineering type to work with this.
And we're still 2 years ahead of the first really, they didn't call them apps back then, but the first killer program, which was VisiCalc. But nonetheless, people were starting to play with these and trying to figure out what to do with it.
Yeah, what can I build with this? What are the options now that I have this thing at home?
And then in 1981, IBM entered the picture. They saw that there's enough is happening to where there's a market for this, and they created a very unique situation where they had a small spin-off group that went down to Boca Raton, Florida, and created the IBM PC there. So it was a totally different mentality for them at the time, and this is the machine that gave the microcomputer credibility in business. As soon as IBM entered the picture, all of a sudden it's legitimate to buy a microcomputer for your business.
Well, it's in movies and stuff, because I was right after the 80s when I was born, but if I look at like Wall Street or something and you start looking at the computer, you start seeing stuff like that in offices. It starts becoming this familiar thing to see that gray IBM machine sitting on desks throughout an office. So it really became like the industry standard from what I could tell, because it was being portrayed in everything. Right,
and they had more of an open architecture. Whereas some of the other manufacturers were a little more proprietary, so they needed people to write software and to do things.
And that was a debate at the time, because Steve Jobs was not really for open architecture, while Steve Wozniak was. So you were having all these conversations at the time of what should computing be, right?
And then portable computing, which is kind of humorous actually. When it's
very portable,
45 pounds, but. This is considered to be one of the first portable computers, the Osborne 1. And the keyboard would fold into the main unit, and it would clip in, and then you would carry this thing out like a very heavy piece of luggage.
With your keyboard dragging behind you.
So we can edit that out. Somebody took the keyboard off.
It's cool how the keyboard tucks in the bottom, though.
That's one of the problems they had. See that it would come unclipped, and it's still coming unclipped, so that's not a good
thing. It's been around for 40 plus years. The joints start to wear.
We can forgive the plastic parts after 40 years.
I don't think it needs to be carried too much anymore, so it's good.
Yes. And then here's the Lisa that I mentioned when we're talking about using the graphics idea and the mouse from the Xerox Alto. And this is an original Lisa 1, which had the 5 1/4 inch floppy drives. Later versions of Lisa had the 3 1/2 inch drives.
This is really where Steve Jobs kind of started putting his mark on a lot of the technology. You know, Steve Wozniak was definitely Apple 1 and 2. That was his baby technologically.
Right. He took it through the Apple II GS and then went off and did other exciting things.
Yep. So this is really where you start to see Steve Jobs putting that mark on the world of technology.
Yeah, it's kind of speaking of that. This is kind of a big part of the Steve Jobs story in 3 machines that just happen to be chronological on our timeline here. The first one is the Macintosh, which was the more mainstream version of the Lisa, with the mouse and with all the graphics. This was also the last thing he did at Apple before he left. Once he left Apple, he wanted to create the best computer ever.
Yeah.
And what he did was he created the Next. And this is the most unusual looking machine, especially in that time frame.
Well, I know it's not a perfect cube. I know that was a big deal. It has to be
Right.
slightly off.
Right, exactly. But it had so many innovations in it. And actually the Next Cube is the machine that Tim Berners-Lee used to host the first World Wide Web server. So there's significance in the whole internet world with the Next Cube. It has its own special place.
It was the first step of someone accessing that place that we all use nowadays. The same protocol we still use to this day started right on that type of machine. So even though many people didn't really ever see or work with the Next because they were very limited in their use, they were targeted at educational institutions, there was also a lot of business strategy behind the creation of this machine that led to the, again, modern day Apple.
And they're also very expensive.
That was what if you want to make the best computer in the world,
It's not going to be cheap.
he arguably did, but you know, there's rules to that.
Right. And interestingly, it was because of the software that was developed at Next, which was a very good operating system, very good user interface, to the point where when Gil Amelio, who was brought in as the CEO to save Apple, he knew immediately that they needed a new operating system. So he looked at 2 companies. He looked at Next, but before he looked at Next, he was looking at a company called BE. And most people have never seen a B.
Not heard that one.
You'll see it in our Apple exhibit whenever we open up next year. But he ended up landing on Next, and by purchasing Next, he also ended up purchasing Jobs' capability because Jobs came in with it. And he ended up being the CEO very shortly. Gil was only in for, I think, 500 days or something. He was in for a very short time period as CEO, but he's the one that really kind of
brought Steve Jobs back into the fold.
Yeah, without bringing Jobs back, who knows what would have happened. But anyway, the first major product that Jobs created with the help of folks like Johnny Ive and obviously all the incredible people at Apple was the iMac. And this was a machine meant for mainstream America, and the primary purpose of it was to access the internet. He wanted to have a device that people everywhere could use to go into the internet and have all the functionality.
Well, and these were everywhere. So when those came out in 1998, it came out when I was 7 years old. So I remember when I went to middle school, because admittedly in elementary school, they were still running on some Macintoshes over there, but I get to middle school, and they have this little circular table in the middle of the library with 6 iMacs over there so that you could go on the internet and look up stuff and learn in the library. That is not something I'd had up to that point. So for a lot of people my age, that computer right there, if you didn't have the internet at home, which luckily I did with the dial-up and all that fun stuff before that, but if you didn't, this might have been the first thing you ever entered the internet with.
Do you remember what color they were?
All the colors of that thing?
No, what color was at your school?
So they actually always had the blue color. It looked
Okay.
like they just had all blue over there. So, and I remember there was like an orange one, I think, and a pink one.
Yeah, the blue color, which is what this
Like an
one
aqua,
is,
yeah.
This was called Bondi Blue, and this is the first color that they came out with. Initially, they had 5 colors, and then they started introducing all kinds of new colors in the next version.
I think that's why we had that color, because they got it when it came out. And
they had Dalmatian. They had a flower one. flower power.
And then they did have the iPods and iPhones, and just a brief color change can do a lot for a device.
Yeah, and one of the cool stories with the colors is that at this point in time, it was very much dealerships, that would sell these. There was no Apple stores yet, and it was Apple dealers. So you had to be a certified Apple dealer, and they would be sent just like cars are sent to car dealerships. They would be sent, whatever allotment of just random colors they would happen to get. And I know for a fact that in our local area that there were dealers in Georgia that would trade with dealers in Tennessee. And the Tennessee would trade a red one that a Tennessee guy would have for an orange one that a guy in Georgia would have for obvious reasons. They were going for the school colors. So it's just, there's a lot of fun little stories like that go along with just the creativity of having something that's not a beige box.
Well, it said what Apple was going to be now. We're going to be fun, we're going to be innovative, we're going to be exciting. And needless to say, for all of Steve Jobs' tenure there for the rest of that time, it was all of those things. I mean, as far as it goes, this personal computing collection is something that for a lot of our viewers, this is what the computer world means to them. They're not always spending their time in a data center necessarily. They're not spending their time by a supercomputer, but this is all so deeply familiar. And what I love is, again, with this cloud computing industry we're in, you can work off something like this and spin up something like a quantum computer. And all of this somehow works together. So as far as it goes, I think that this is a good place to cut this off. I think that we've really talked about the progression of where we finally access the internet. As far as it goes, all you guys watching, you understand some of the topics that you're able to do once you're able to do this. You're able to go inside a data center that's going to have every type of computing device that you could imagine and be able to use it at your fingertips. So Lonnie, thank you again for walking us through this collection. After this, I'm going to talk to our camera person over here real quick to get a little more detail on some of the events you guys are having throughout the summer, because we went through a lot of the stuff you have today specifically focused on computing and the cloud, but there's a lot more here, and we want to talk a little bit about that before we leave. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Lonnie. It was good chatting.
Same here.
Thanks, everyone, for joining our podcast today. So to finish this up, I want to actually introduce you to who brought me into this podcast. So this is a person I've known for a long time, you could say, my entire life. This is my mom, Chris Youngblood, the executive director here at the museum. So welcome. I wanted to have her join just because her job here goes past just necessarily the history of the museum and all those things being maintained. It's a lot of the operations of what happens over here, and they do a lot of cool, relatively interactive stuff for people, individuals, their families, their kids. So let us know a little more about what you guys have going on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I've been watching your podcast for a little while now. You do a very good job. That's the mom in me, but also the professional. We have a lot of events happening, especially this summer. So as your viewers are watching this, we have a new evening that we're calling Night Mode that will be running on the second Friday evening of June, July, and August, where we're just staying open past 5 until 9 o'clock. Open the bar use your credit card, get a drink, but you can walk around the museum with your drink and just enjoy the exhibits in a different kind of environment before going to dinner or after dinner. So that's new. We have hundreds of children who will be coming in starting the first week in June for camps this year. They're doing a lot with AI, autonomous vehicles, programming, website design, just a lot of different subjects.
They're going to be learning to code break with your Enigma machine?
I think they might just have to. So, but that's a lot of fun. Speaking of, we have a book club twice a year. We just read The Rose Code, which was World War II and encryption, so perfect backdrop. So we just do a lot of things here ourselves, but then we also are a place that people can come. So we have, of course, field trips and scouts, but we also have families that come for reunions. We have corporate opportunities and holiday parties. The state of Roswell our city of Roswell gets together and we seat 450 people in our ballroom. So we've got a lot of event space for folks to use. So in just under 6 years, we have done a tremendous amount of work on this museum. And next year...
A lot to go, too.
Oh, yes. Next year, On April 1st, which is the 50th anniversary of Apple, we are opening a new exhibit called Inspire, or I Inspire, 20,000 square feet of artifacts, culture, marketing. We have prototypes. It's a tremendous collection.
Will there be a working
things.
Apple store in there?
I don't know about that, but you may run to the Apple store afterwards because you're going to be inspired to do something new. But we're really excited about that. It's going to be a tremendous opportunity for all of us here in the Atlanta area, and we're likely to see people come in just for this exhibit from all over. So we're excited.
It's an incredible facility. It's huge, by the way, too. She mentioned ballroom. We showed you guys a little bit of some of the things going on here, but you're going to see things like a Salvador Dali exhibit. You're going to see a space exhibit. You're going to see a Pixar machine. If you're into that kind of thing, I am. All sorts of stuff, and it's still just expanding. They have an entire upstairs that is being developed right now. This is just one of the floors. So make it out here. It's in Roswell, Georgia, Mimms Museum of Technology and Art. Otherwise, join us next time. We look forward to telling you guys more about the cloud.